Hi, everybody. I've got to admit, I think I'm the one here that really bothers Eric, because everybody else, we have 10 minutes to speak, and I've never given a 10-minute speech before. I have cut it down to less than an hour. I should also explain, I'm a lot older than I look. I'm older than Joe Biden, and that being the case, to be honest, I was expecting that I would have a teleprompt. So that's why I brought this. Anyway, thanks to both Eric and Jasmine for the introduction. Thank you also for the opportunity for me to tell my story of an experience that I had that hopefully shows determination in the face of major corporate fraud, dishonesty, denial, and adversity. And hopefully it also has a positive message. I'd also have to say I'm conscious I'm a bit of a fraud here myself, because everybody else's story is personal. Mine wasn't so much personal. It was in the corporate sector. I just happened to be there. Anyway, my story is that of a corporate whistleblower who uncovered multiple business fraudulent transactions. What I did, what others did, the ensuing criminal and civil cases that took place over 7 years, the need for others to set out to destroy my credibility to preserve their own, and the outcomes, and most importantly, the learnings and takeaway messages. Like Helen, I'm originally from New Zealand. My story commenced in February 1986, possibly before quite a few of you were born, when I took up the role of Chief Financial Officer, Company Secretary in a medium-sized New Zealand publicly listed company. We were manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers. I was excited to join the company as it was a natural step from my previous role, but before long I found myself in the middle of a difficult professional situation that compromised my values, my ethics, and my legal responsibilities. It was a sleepy 70-year-old company that had been taken over some 12 months before by a wealthy businessman and his son-in-law. The son-in-law, who was an actuary is really quite a different sort of a person. They are specialists around maths and mergers and takeovers and acquisitions, but very, very good with numbers. So the son-in-law, who was by now the major shareholder of the group, had been appointed the managing director. I guess you can do that if you own 51% of the company. He was a bright guy in his late 30s. He saw himself as a high-flying entrepreneur. So this MD, he was in the process of turning the group into a diversified investment company on a smaller scale of what people that you'd be familiar with, like Robert Holmes à Court, Christopher Skase, Alan Bond, John Elliott, and others were doing here in Australia at the same time. Now remember that this was in the mid-1980s, when the financial markets had just been deregulated on both sides of the Tasman, and whatever we touched seemed to turn to gold, even if we didn't really understand why. So the company was the New Zealand agent representing a wide range of international companies involved in hydroelectric, geothermal, engineering, electrical, rail, aviation, and by that I mean corporate jets. So we had the agency for British Aerospace, and also robotics. Those were the industries that we were in. We were doing everything. We were also very aggressive in putting together highly complicated financing and tax-driven arrangements in tax haven jurisdictions. From an accountant's point of view, I was in heaven. This was an exciting time. So, first of all, I've broken this into, so that's the background. So what did I find? When I arrived, the company hadn't run a ledger. Apologies for this, ledgers are things that accountants do. They hadn't done it for 11 months. But during that period, the group had embarked on its largest ever joint venture, in fact with an Australian company by the name of Tyree Industries and Westinghouse, and you'll all be familiar with Westinghouse here in Australia. So at the very time that the group needed to have excellent financial records, we didn't have an up-to-date or accurate handle on our own financial position. I and my team were working ridiculous hours as we tried to catch up and keep up with what was going on. In my own case, I was working 80+ hours a week. It was unrelenting. This went on for the 20 months that I was with the company. And the reason I did this? Determination. Foolish determination. to do what I thought no one else could or would do. I was driven by pride and ego. I also thought it might possibly be good for my career. However, the impact on myself and our family was huge. I was hardly ever at home. If I was lucky, I'd have dinner with my wife and our three young children, once a week. The children were nearly always asleep when I arrived home. In fact, to be honest, I'd arrive home, they'd all be asleep, I'd go into their rooms and I'd kick their bassinets to wake them up. Have you ever known a parent who would do that? But that's what I did. I was so keen to see them. Anyway, it's a true story. So yes, they were nearly always asleep when I did finally arrive home. I was getting by, or in fact not getting by, on 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. I was stressed, frazzled and exhausted, but pride and ego kept me going. As time went on, I had increasing concerns, not only about the accounting backlog, but also the level of borrowings and debt that the company had. At the same time, the company had embarked on an aggressive acquisition program of either buying or taking major shareholdings in a pharmaceutical company, 2 paint companies, an engineering company, various rural interests, an oil exploration company. Goodness me, if you weren't buying an oil exploration company in the mid-1980s, you really weren't there. A horse stud and an Australian publicly listed company, all paid for either by borrowings or share issues. And the reason for the share issues is because profits quadrupled and the share price went the same way. It quadrupled in a matter of about 18 months, which the MD owned 51% of. We were on the way up. There was no stopping us. So that's what I found. So now what did I do? So over a number of months, my thoughts moved from doubt as to the wisdom and prudence of some of my MD's actions to worry, to serious concern, through to certainty that I had a dishonest MD. I was really fortunate, actually. Something happened and he instructed me to do an action that was patently illegal. That was the best thing that could have happened. It crystallized that doubt, that concern, the worry to, I've got a crook as an MD. I discovered 9 transactions that I believed were fraudulent, totaling many millions of dollars. I initially took my concerns to the MD himself, which was ridiculous because he already knew of them, whose response was to tell me that everyone was benefiting from the group's growth and that I needed to be more commercial. Essentially, he tried to fob me off. Not convinced, a bit of determination, I then took my concerns to the chairman, but remembering he was the MD's father-in-law, which definitely complicated matters. I'm sure I wasn't discussed on Christmas Day. The chairman instructed me not to raise the concerns at board meetings. Now, I was conflicted because I was the company secretary as well as the CFO. He would take the matters up privately with the MD, or this is what he told me, and he would seek to resolve the issues that I'd brought to his attention. Having said that, there were 8 directors, and whilst I wasn't able to raise them at board meetings, I did privately advise 6 of them extensively of what I had found of my concerns before I finally resigned. I kept detailed records of my discussions, I took legal advice, I advised the auditors, and I worked with the chairman for 2 or 3 months in seeking to resolve my concerns. However, the MD's lies and deceit continued. He could no longer afford to tell me the truth, and I could no longer afford to believe him. So I handed in my resignation in early August 1987, and I left 8 weeks later on the 30th of September 1987. I probably should have brought a lotto ticket because that couldn't have been better timing, and you'll understand why. Because 3 weeks later, the world share market crashed on the 19th of October 1987, which came to be known as Black Monday. In one day, we had a 22% drop in the share market. Recently, with what's been happening in the US and Trump and tariffs, I think we got to about 4% in one day. So this was 22% in one day. All of a sudden, the world was upside down. 6 months after I left, literally to the day, the group collapsed with a loss to shareholders and creditors of around about $150 million. Now, in 1987, $150 million was still pretty significant. So that's what I did. What did others do? And this is where I hope the learnings come. This is when things got more interesting. You should see people duck for cover when everything turns to custard. Nearly everyone denied knowing anything, couldn't remember, or blamed the auditors. One director who I'd actually was the person who I'd shared absolutely everything that I knew with and had met with him about 20 times, including multiple visits to his home and numerous telephone calls where he'd be checking in on me, and who I'd shared all of my records with, he claimed that I may have told him about my concerns, but as he didn't have his hearing aid in at the time, he couldn't actually hear what I was saying. Fortunately, I'd kept detailed notes of my conversations with the individual directors and the other parties, as well as copies of their responses and advice to me. Civil charges were brought against the auditors, the directors, and just about everybody else who had a passing involvement with the group, fortunately not including myself. The good thing was I had no money. There was no point in suing me. There's a business idea for you, Nick, that you can perhaps work to. Have no money and nobody will sue you. This process then unfolded over the next 7 years, and at the time it was the longest running commercial court case in New Zealand's history. Next was the criminal case. On the 31st of March 1988, 6 months to the day from when I had resigned and left, the police escorted the managing director from the company premises. Over the next 2 years, the Justice Department, the Serious Fraud Office, investigated the company collapse. The managing director was charged with 11 criminal offences involving fraud and forgery, being the 9 transactions that I'd brought to the attention of the chairman, plus 2 further offences that occurred after I'd left the company. Because of my knowledge of events, I was the principal witness in all of these investigations and also the criminal case. In the criminal case alone, I was in the witness box for 4 days. Unbelievably, the lawyer that I'd sought legal advice from before I resigned, and this is incredible, and who I had briefed and detailed and given my files to, he was the same lawyer who ended up representing the MD in the criminal trial. A shocking conflict of interest. The MD was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years jail, although he served only 13 months and spent much of that time on a work parole scheme and on weekend home leave. Pathetic. There is some good news. The MD was declared bankrupt, so he wasn't able to pay his lawyer. Good to see that karma is still out there working. We then moved to the civil case, which took place quite some years later in 1994. A courtroom packed with 20 QCs, Queen's Counsels and barristers representing the 11 parties being sued, which were primarily the directors and the auditors. The lawyers acting for the liquidator, their evidence ran for 3 months, but I was not amongst the witnesses called. Even though I was the person who had the most knowledge of what had happened, they chose not to call me as a witness, as my evidence was more damning of the directors than the auditors. The problem they had was the auditors had PI, professional indemnity cover. The directors had considered taking out PI cover, but decided, no, we don't need that. So it was important for the lawyers acting for the liquidators to prove that it was the auditors who were primarily to blame, which in my opinion wasn't the case. The liquidators' lawyers were anxious to lay the blame, as I say, solely at the auditors rather than the directors because of the insurance implications. However, I was then called as the first witness for the auditors. My affidavit was 140 pages long. As I was about to begin my evidence, one of the QCs stood up and said, "What Mr. Kennedy has written here and presented to the court is so damning that I have ever read that I would ask, Your Honour," and it was the Chief Justice of New Zealand who was presiding over it, "I would ask Mr. Kennedy to read his 140 pages. Now, something they didn't know was, apart from being an accountant, I used to also be a radio announcer. So for many years, I've actually really liked the sound of my own voice. And here I was, 140 pages. I'll have them dancing before they know it. Anyway, we got to about page 3 and the guy stood up again, the QC stood up again and said, "Thank you, Your Honour, I think we can take it as read." But it was, his words were, "I want to see the colour of the man." So the pressure was really on. It was like a huge chess game, each playing against each other. And I had 20 of these QCs coming at me. To avoid being held negligent, the directors had to destroy my evidence and thereby my credibility. After 5 days in the witness box on this occasion, I was still being queried by QC number 2. I had another 18 to go, and they too were the friendly ones. Still taking me through my evidence and questioning me on my affidavit. 18 more QCs to go. As I was about to enter the witness box for the 6th day, the parties decided to settle. Once the directors had seen my evidence and files, which they'd already seen actually previously, they realised that the game was up. They had no defence. I told them what was going on. I had told them what was going on. They chose to ignore it as I was expendable, dispensable, whereas the MD wasn't. He was the one driving the share price up, or so they thought. The outcomes from the civil case, the auditors and directors were both found negligent and incurred significant fines, but nothing like the $150 million that the shareholders and the creditors had lost. The learnings. Good news, Eric, we're nearly there. I wouldn't have wished this experience on my worst enemy. It was harrowing and hung over myself and my family for 7 intense years. Having said that, I wouldn't have missed it for quids. I learnt so much during that 7-year period. My learnings and takeaway messages are, first, be wary of people who are driven by ego and greed. I only had one, ego. The combination of ego and greed, it's truly a lethal combination. My second learning, if you're a company director or a senior manager in an organisation and an employee comes to you with concerns over matters of proprietary, fraud or corporate governance, for goodness sake, listen to them. They've gone through a washing machine to get to your door. They need your support. They need your guidance. Investigate. And if you find what they're saying to be true, take decisive action. That didn't happen in my case. That person needs your help and active support. My third learning, if you're an employee and you believe you have a dishonest managing director, report it and get out quickly. Keep detailed records of what you found, what you did, who you told, what they told you, and most importantly, what they actually did. My fourth learning. While work is important, family and life balance is far more important. Don't let the two get out of balance. I had them way out of whack. My fifth and final learning, life isn't always fair, but it's much better than the alternative. Well, that's my story. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful in considering what to do if you ever find yourself in the position of being a whistleblower, or more particularly, if you're a director and a whistleblower comes to you for advice, guidance, and support. Thank you very much.